Hola, muy buenos días con todos y con todas. Bueno, creo que es necesario que empecemos con el evento dentro de la conferencia o de la reunión anual del GANRI 2020. Primero quiero enviar un afectuoso saludo a todos y a todas quienes se han dado cita y que se encuentran conectados a través de este módulo virtual. La nueva normalidad lo que nos impone es que a través de lo digital podamos estar conectados. Tiene sus ventajas, indudablemente, de poder estar reunidos de diferentes partes del mundo para poder realizar esta reunión anual de la Alianza Global de Instituciones de Derechos Humanos. Muy buenos días a los colegas de las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, distinguidos representantes del Sistema de Naciones Unidas y también a quienes son participantes y al público en general. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias. Como presidente de la Alianza Global de Instituciones Nacionales de Derechos Humanos, GANRI, tengo el honor de dar inicio a la conferencia anual de GANRI sobre el cambio climático y el rol de las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, que se va a realizar en el marco de la reunión anual de GANRI, que en esta ocasión, por primera vez, como lo decía, se la va a realizar en un formato virtual, debido a las restricciones impuestas por el COVID-19, por la nueva normalidad de esta pandemia. Quiero empezar, estimados colegas, agradeciendo a cada uno de ustedes por su participación y un agradecimiento especial a la señora Michelle Bachelet, alta comisionada para los derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, al señor Ashim Steiner, administrador del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, PNUD, y al señor Inger Anderson, director ejecutivo del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente, por tomarse un tiempo para dirigirnos unas palabras en la apertura de esta conferencia. De la misma manera, un agradecimiento especial a quienes representan, a las instituciones que representan su cooperación en la organización o que han dado su cooperación en la organización de este encuentro virtual. El tema que nos ocupa hoy, el cambio climático y su afectación en los derechos humanos, es de fundamental trascendencia, no solo para un país o un estado en particular, sino para el mundo. Para todos los habitantes de este planeta son evidentes los efectos del cambio climático. Vemos grandes inundaciones en ríos, mares, mientras que en otros lados del planeta hay sequías prolongadas, cambios de clima. Todos somos testigos de estos cambios bruscos de temperaturas. Por un lado, altas temperaturas y por el otro, obviamente, incendios y temperaturas extremadamente bajas que amenazan la supervivencia del planeta, de nuestra naturaleza como tal. Sin embargo, los efectos en los derechos humanos no siempre son tan evidentes. Quienes estamos involucrados en la defensa y promoción de los derechos humanos tenemos la obligación de visibilizar la amenaza que significa el cambio climático para los derechos fundamentales como el acceso al agua, al saneamiento, a la salud, a la alimentación, a una vivienda digna, al desarrollo y, por supuesto, a la vida. Las consecuencias son más graves para los países y los grupos de población que viven en una situación de pobreza porque no cuentan con las condiciones necesarias para mitigar los efectos del cambio climático. Por eso, a nivel de Naciones Unidas ya se ha demostrado que el cambio climático es un multiplicador de desigualdades y vulnerabilidades. Por ende, se encuentra dentro de la agenda de Naciones Unidas para efectos de llegar a reducir el tema del efecto invernadero y de esa manera generar un compromiso a nivel global sobre lo que significa el cambio climático y lo que debemos hacer los estados y las sociedades en su conjunto para mitigar y reducir las consecuencias negativas que genera el cambio climático. Ahí se inscribe nuestra labor como instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, porque es fundamental que a través de las CNDH exijamos a los estados que cumplan con sus compromisos internacionales, pero sobre todo cumplan con esta obligación de proteger a las personas más vulnerables y de prevenir los efectos adversos del cambio climático con un enfoque siempre, fundamentalmente, con un enfoque de derechos humanos. Precisamente, el objetivo de esta conferencia es generar un espacio de reflexión, no solamente sobre las consecuencias de lo que estamos hablando de este cambio climático en los derechos humanos, sino principalmente sobre las estrategias que podemos adoptar las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos para contribuir a la protección de los derechos de nuestra población en un contexto ambiental diverso. Y no olvidemos nuestro deber de proteger también a las personas defensoras de derechos ambientales y de la naturaleza. Quiero invitarles nuevamente a aportar con sus experiencias y opiniones sobre este importante tema y sumar esfuerzos para hacer un frente global, un frente mundial ante la amenaza que se cierne sobre el mundo entero. Para finalizar, quiero agradecer a mis colegas de las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos de Argentina, de Colombia, de Escocia, de Kenia, Madagascar, Filipinas, Samoa, por sus intervenciones, y también indudablemente a David Boy, relator especial sobre derechos humanos y el medio ambiente, y a Dennis Van Berkel de la Fundación Urgente. Muchas gracias, y en estos momentos cedo la palabra al doctor Ali Al-Marri, secretario general de GANRI, y agradezco a cada uno de ustedes por su participación. Muchas gracias. Adelante, doctor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أسعد الله مساءكم وقبل ذلك صباحكم بكل خير أينما كنتم. بداية أود أن أشكر مفوضية الأمم المتحدة السامية لحقوق الإنسان وبرنامج الأمم المتحدة للإنمائي وكذلك برنامج الأمم المتحدة للبيئة على رعايتهم وشراكتهم الفاعلة، فما كانت هذه الفعالية لترى النور لولا دعمهم. كما أود أن أتوجه بالشكر الجزيل لجميع المتحدثين والمشاركين معنا في هذه الفعالية. إن تغير المناخ هو واحدة من أكبر التحديات التي تواجه العالم في يومنا هذا، فلسنوات عديدة أهملنا كمجتمع هذا الكوكب الذي نعيش فيه، واليوم أصبح خطورة هذه الظاهرة وضخامتها بادية للعيان، وهو ما يستوجب أن نتخذ إجراءات حاسمة قادرة على تخفيف آثار الإهمال وبناء القدرات حتى لا تتوارث الأجيال القادمة الضرر. وكما يشير اتفاق باريس، فإن البشرية جمعاء مكلفة بتعزيز الاستجابة العالمية لخطر تغير المناخ، وفي هذا الصدد تقدم لنا الاتفاقيات والمعاهدات الدولية المتعلقة بالموضوع وأجندة 2030 دليلاً موفراً للتوجيهات ومحددات لالتزامات كل مؤسسة من المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان والجهات الفاعلة والمحلية والعالمية. إن هذه الظاهرة تؤثر على حقوق الإنسان بشتى الطرق، حيث لها تأثير مباشر على حق البشر في الحصول على الماء والصحة والحياة، وبالمثل فقد تضرر ملايين البشر وسيتضررون مستقبلاً في سبل عيشهم ونشاطهم الإنتاجي لاضطرارهم للهجرة. ومن نازحون داخل البلد الواحدة أو عبر الأوطان سوى مثال واضح على ذلك، ولذلك فمن واجب جميع الدول دراسة الأسباب الكامنة وراء هذه الأنماط من النزوح، وربط الهجرة البيئية بتغير المناخ، ووضع تدابير حماية مباشرة وتكميلية. والمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في إطار اختصاصها غير مستثناة من هذا الواجب، ولدينا التزام تجاه العالم أجمع وشتى أشكال الحياة فيه، كما ونطلع بدور الرئيسي في المراقبة والإبلاغ عن حالة حقوق الإنسان وكافة أشكال انتهاكات المعايير الدولية وإسداء المشورة للحكومات والبرلمانات. فضلا عن ذلك يجب علينا تضمين تقييمات الأثر قبل أي مشاريع، واتخاذ جميع التدابير الإجرائية المتعلقة بتغير المناخ، كما ونشجع مشاركة مختلف الجهات المعنية كالسكان الأصليين والجهات المعنية المحلية الأخرى. ومن واجبنا أيضا دمج تغير المناخ والنهج البيئي في التحريات وأنظمة الشكوى الخاصة بنا من أجل تسهيل الوصول إلى العلاج. ويمكن لنا كمؤسسات وطنية لحقوق الإنسان أن نلعب دور الميسرين ونضع تغير المناخ على رأس جداول الأعمال الوطنية والإقليمية والعالمية، حتى تنفيذ الظروف السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية والبيئية للحد من مواطن الضعف التي تخلقها هذه الظاهرة وتزكيها. لقد أحرزت أهداف التنمية المستدامة بالفعل تقدم كبيرا في تحديد الطريق في هذه المعركة، وعلى وجه التحديد يدعو الهدف 13 من أهداف التنمية المستدامة إلى العمل المناخي، ويشدد على الحاجة الملحة إلى اتخاذ إجراءات عاجلة للتصدي للتغير المناخ وآثاره من أجل إنقاذ الأرواح وسبل العيش. ويعد إعلام ميريدا بشأن دور المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في تنفيذ جدول أعمال 2030 للتنمية المستدامة بداية جيدة لمعالجة هذه القضية. ومع ذلك يجب علينا كمؤسسات وطنية لحقوق الإنسان التحرك السريع نحو تطوير اتفاقيات وخطط عمل محددة بشأن تغير المناخ. ودعنا لا ننسى أن المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان هي بمثابة مؤشرات لإنجاز هذه الأجندة، كما نلعب دور الجهة الفاعلة الرئيسية لتحقيقها. وعليه يسعدني أن نجتمع اليوم لوضع هذه القضية المهمة على رأس جدول الأعمال، فهي قضية لن تحدد مستقبلنا فحسب، بل ومستقبل الأجيال القادمة أيضا. ولعل هذه الفعالية قد اكتسبت أهمية بالغة وقيمة كبيرة لتحديد تأثير حقوق الإنسان على تغير المناخ وأدوار المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان وتجاربها من جميع أنحاء العالم لتطوير استراتيجيات عملية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان، وكذلك لتعميق مفهومنا على ثغرات الحماية والفرصة المتاحة لتعزيز حماية حقوق الإنسان في سياق تغير المناخ. واسمحوا لي أن أغتنم هذه الفرصة لأطلب الدعم من منظومة الأمم المتحدة، ولا سيما من شركائنا في برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي، مفوضية الأمم المتحدة السامية لحقوق الإنسان، وكذلك برنامج الأمم المتحدة للبيئة، من أجل دعم التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان، وكذلك المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في كل دولة والشبكات الإقليمية، حتى نتمكن من بناء النمو والقوة، لأننا كمؤسسات وطنية لحقوق الإنسان نتصدى لآثار حقوق الإنسان على تغير المناخ على الصعيدين الفردي والجماعي. آملا مخلصا أن تكون هذه الفعالية هي الأولى من سلسلة فعاليات في هذا الشأن. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
Muchas gracias al doctor Ali por su intervención. A continuación, es un placer darle la palabra a la señora Michelle Bachelet, alta comisionada para los Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas, quien se dirigirá a todos nosotros. Por favor, doctora Bachelet.
Greetings to all of you. I commend the work that the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions have been doing, and in particular, how it has addressed climate change. This work is essential to the protection of all human rights. Climate change is already damaging the effective enjoyment of a broad range of human rights, including the right to life, to development, and to cultural life. Entire states are threatened. Ultimately, climate change threatens life on our planet. NHRIs can help promote much more effective, informed, and participatory climate action that can both benefit people's rights and preserve our environment. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed the deep links between a healthy environment, human health, and human rights. To recover better and prevent future global shocks, including viral pandemics, we must protect the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In the past few years, we have had the pleasure to work with CANRI in the organization of these annual conferences and other activities, as well as with many individual NHRIs seeking to engage on the issue of human rights and climate change. This work has helped put in action the human rights frameworks that ensure moral, ethical, and legal accountability for climate commitments. For these efforts to take hold, there must be both political will and adequate understanding of the links between human rights and climate change. Human rights must become part of the climate solution. As states bodies with a broad mandate to promote and protect human rights, NHRIs play a key role in climate mitigation and adaptation by educating the public about the human rights impacts of environmental harms, monitoring these impacts, and advising governments to adopt human rights-based environmental policies. They can also handle complaints and promote accountability at a national level and through regional and universal human rights mechanisms. I have been impressed by the valuable and important work being done by many NHRIs, even in today's extraordinary circumstances. And I hope you have already begun sharing and discussing some of these experiences during the first day of this annual meeting. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, OHCHR has been working hard to integrate human rights considerations throughout the measurement, review, and verification processes that the agreement established, as well as in national determined contributions. But even before COVID hit, fulfillment of the Paris Agreement was already lagging. The pandemic must be a wake-up call that leads states to renew their efforts to achieve these vital commitments. NHRIs can play an important role in this effort by raising awareness among officials and the public, submitting parallel reports on human rights and climate change to the UNFCCC and to human rights mechanism, providing technical advice to their governments and parliaments, supporting the integration of human rights in national climate policies and communications, and providing a platform for the airing of climate grievances. I wish you a fruitful discussion today and success in your endeavors. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Las palabras de la doctora Michelle Bachelet como alta comisionada por los derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas. A continuación me permito dar paso al señor Ashim Steiner, administrador del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo PEN. Por favor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the climate crisis is the defining challenge of our time. Extreme weather and climate events have increased in frequency, intensity, and severity as a result of climate change, hitting vulnerable communities disproportionately hard. Over the past 50 years, some 11,000 disasters attributed to weather, climate, and water-related hazards have claimed over 2 million lives. It has cost the world economy some $3.6 trillion. The climate crisis is also having a severe impact on human rights, everything from the right to life, the right to a place to live and work, or the right to food and safe drinking water. However, major shifts are now taking place. More than 150 countries already recognize the right to a healthy environment through national and regional legislation as well as treaties. We are also on the cusp of a universal right to a healthy environment for all being recognized. This will be vital to strengthen the wider international recognition of the link between human rights and climate change. And placing people at the center of our approaches to address climate change and support climate justice is therefore crucial. To this end, national human rights institutions serve as the frontline human rights defenders to liaise with and represent those most affected by the climate crisis. To bolster this work, the United Nations Development Programme has supported over 100 national human rights institutions across the globe to enhance their ability to defend, protect, and promote the right to a healthy environment, everywhere from Bangladesh to Sudan to Costa Rica. As these institutions stand up to the climate crisis, they are serving as a beacon to guide communities across the globe. In partnership with the UN Human Rights Office and the UN Environment Programme, UNDP remains committed to supporting the work of national human rights institutions. They are playing an intrinsic role in our collective efforts to achieve the Global Sustainable Development Goals and to shape that greener, more inclusive, and more sustainable future. Finally, as we mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement this month, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you who gather today for your efforts at this pivotal moment for our global community. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias por esas palabras del señor Ashim Steiner, administrador del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo de PEN. De la misma manera, quiero dar paso al señor Inger Anderson, director ejecutivo del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente, quien también se dirigirá a este panel, a este evento, con unas palabras de bienvenida. Por favor.
I send warm greetings to all participants, and I thank you for inviting me to speak at the annual conference of the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions. This is the first time that I have the honor to address this conference, and I'm very proud that UNEP is a co-sponsor to this year's conference, together with my good friends at UNDP and the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. Our partnership with you, our partnership at UNEP with you, together with our friends at UNDP and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, reflect our commitment to taking a rights-based approach to climate action and to supporting the efforts of national human rights institutions. Because in addition to the pandemic, the world faces three planetary crises: a climate crisis, a biodiversity and nature crisis, and a pollution and waste crisis. And addressing these three crises and building back better from COVID-19 must be underpinned by a rights-based approach that leaves no one behind. Climate change has adverse impact on a wide range of human rights, including the right to life, to health, to housing, to water and sanitation, and the right to live in a healthy environment. And actions to combat climate change can only be truly effective and truly sustainable when human rights are integrated as both a process and an outcome. And here national human rights institutions have a critical role to play. You are independent. You are that voice advocating for human rights, for climate justice, and for international and intergenerational equity. You are the agents of change. Often your work is not easy, and I commend you for standing against injustice despite concerns around harassment, threats, intimidation, and other forms of violence. We need to understand that human rights and environmental rights go together. It's not a choice of either or, both are a must. And we at UNEP, through our long-standing environmental law program, remain committed to delivering for the planet and for people and supporting your work. So I very much look forward to our continued partnership, and I thank you.
Muchas gracias a Inger, director ejecutivo del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente. Bueno, quiero agradecer a cada uno de los panelistas quienes han intervenido y nos han dado la bienvenida a esta conferencia anual de GANRI sobre el cambio climático y el impacto, la gestión que como instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos tenemos a la hora de enfrentar esta gran amenaza para el planeta entero. A continuación, quiero dar paso a Michael Walford, director del Instituto Alemán de Derechos Humanos y miembro del Comité de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, quien nos acompañará y nos ayudará con la moderación del evento. Por favor, Michael.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Thanks a lot, Chair, for this introduction, and I'm glad that we had such an impressive, let's say, number of institutions addressing us, and we are glad that we have this support also in the UN agencies. I would like to welcome you, Excellencies, colleagues and friends from national human rights institutions and guests from other institutions to our annual conference with the issue of climate change and the role of national human rights institutions. And I will not make a sixth introduction, don't be afraid. I'm starting to moderate the event, and our plan is to, in a way, condense what we had planned originally in March to be a full day conference to consider this issue to 1.5 hours, which also will cause a lot of problems for all the speakers because they are also condensed from 10-minute speaks to 2-minute speaks. So we all have to live with this. But I hope that it's not just only condensed, it's also enriching, because we invited several speakers from national human rights institutions and guests because we believe this can be really interesting and enriching for our debate. Climate change is, as we have just heard, the largest probably global driver impacting on the enjoyment of human rights in the future. And there is a human rights obligations of state to stop their own contribution to it, but there is also the response for climate change done by states can also be a problem, yeah? A human rights problem. It might be inadequate, states might not do enough or nothing, or maybe doing the wrong things. Or it can be that even well-intended projects for renewable energies might have human rights impacts, which we have to analyze. So the roles for national human rights institutions we want to, let's say, look at in the next 1.5 hours are those we have put into 4 clusters, which we would like to discuss with you. First, having a look on the impacts of climate change, then to identify what is at stake at national level, what state policies can do. Then we want to look at what are the roles we can play in raising complaints or in litigation. And at the end, we want to look what we can do in monitoring. This will be all very short. It's our start for discussion. And let us not forget, we want to endorse at the end a statement which would give us a certain mandate or commitment also for us to act together as a Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions in the upcoming month. That is what we had at stake, and we have, because of the condensed time, not the possibility that many people can speak from the room as it would be normally if you would have a day. So we ask you to put your questions into the Q&A file, which is down at the bottom of your screen. It will be read by the GANRI Secretariat, and I will be informed. So that will allow me to see what type of contributions comes from your side, and maybe to raise the issues also in our further deliberations, take the issues up, and then bring them also to our attention. So let's start with the first block. We have a first lead question, which is saying, what impact have you observed has climate change on human rights? Yeah, that is what we would like to discuss, and we get it in 3 languages, well prepared. And we have some speakers, and I have to be strict but not unpolite in the moderation, but I will first give the word to Mireille Rabenoro from the National Human Rights Institutions of Madagascar, the chair. Mireille, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Je m'adresserai à l'Assemblée en français parce que c'est ma langue, ma première langue étrangère, disons. Donc, Madagascar est le 4e ou le 5e pays au monde le plus exposé au changement climatique, selon les sources. À l'heure où nous parlons, il y a plus d'1 million de Malgaches qui souffrent de la malnutrition dans les régions sud de Madagascar, dont plus de 500 000 souffrent de la vraie famine qui affecte le plus les enfants et les femmes, avec plusieurs centaines d'enfants décédés. La cause, c'est une pluviométrie qui a toujours été faible, mais ces 3 dernières années, il n'y a pas eu de pluie du tout. Donc, il n'y a pas eu de récolte dans cette région dont la population vit essentiellement de l'agriculture. Les gens affectés par cette famine, cette sécheresse, n'ont même plus d'argent pour la migration qui était traditionnelle vers les régions plus favorisées, migration interne qui engendre d'ailleurs d'autres défis encore en matière de droits économiques, sociaux et politiques. Ceci a un impact évident sur les droits de l'homme les plus basiques. Il s'agit de droit à la santé, le droit à la vie d'abord, le droit à la santé, à l'éducation aussi parce que les enfants ne vont plus à l'école parce qu'ils sont à la recherche de nourriture. En résumé, selon l'article 28 de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, toute personne a droit à ce que règne sur le plan social et sur le plan international un ordre tel que les droits et libertés énoncés dans la présente déclaration puissent y trouver effet. C'est cet ordre qui devient de plus en plus difficile à réaliser à mesure que se manifeste le changement climatique. Voilà ma contribution. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thanks, Madame Rabenoro. I think that was already showing how strong the impact is felt in your country. What will be the impact for many, many people in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And I would like now to give the floor to our second speaker, which will be Roberto Cadiz from the National Human Rights Institution in the Philippines. Roberto, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you very much, Michael. So the effects of climate change in our country are it's changing the patterns of precipitation. It's causing extreme weather disturbances, not only in terms of number, increasing the number, but also in terms of intensity. We can see rising sea levels, and also it's also causing ocean acidification. And these phenomena are the ones that are negatively impacting our human rights. They are expansive. They're all over our country, and we consider them as indeed existential threats. The impacts are to individual rights and to community or collective rights. I do not anymore have to enumerate the sectors that are affected because they're the same sectors that have been talked about earlier on by the previous speaker. But they're expansive, almost all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights are impacted. The important collective rights that are now being felt are food security, sustainable development, preservation of culture of our indigenous peoples, equality, and non-discrimination. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roberto, and thanks also for sticking to the time limit because we, as I said, we have a sensitive time frame. We have also invited at all panels not only speakers from national human rights institutions, but also some guests which will contribute with their perspective to the discussions. And our first guest, which we'll now have, is Dennis van Berkel from the Urgenda Foundation, the foundation in the Netherlands, which has run a very important case against the governments of Netherlands' own target on climate change. And Dennis will address us. His foundation has the logo Samen Smeller Duursam, which means together faster and sustainable. You have the word, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the impacts that climate change have already been discussed by a lot of the incredible previous speakers and people on this panel. What I would like to stress is that these impacts will affect all people around the world, not just the people in the more vulnerable countries that often have contributed the least to this problem. Also, the people in the richer parts of the world that have and are still contributing and creating and worsening, making this problem worse, will also be impacted. And that, in fact, was also the finding of the Dutch Supreme Court here in the Netherlands in its judgment late last year, that climate change poses a real threat to both the current and the future inhabitants of the Netherlands, both to their right to life and their right to private life. The court looked at the impacts from heat waves, from more intense storms, from flooding, from sea level rise and forest fires. But it also looked at the fact that there can be tipping points which may occur already between the level of 1.5 degree warming and 2 degree warming with really unimaginable consequences. And also what is important is that these impacts are irreversible and they'll continue to get worse until the moment that we have reached zero emissions. That's the core and the nature of climate change. And it was on the basis of this, on the basis of these threats for the inhabitants in the Netherlands that the Supreme Court found that there was a duty based on human rights on the Netherlands to do its fair share in reducing its emissions in order to stay below the Paris Agreement temperature target.
Thanks, Dennis, for your first input to our agenda. I just want to highlight that in the chat box, which you might follow, there is already other national human rights institutions from Spain, from India, contributing with their own experiences. There was also one question concerning more impacts on Madagascar, which we can't answer here, but please continue to share your, let's say, views and impressions in the chat box. I think it's very helpful contribution. I just want also to flag that the German Institute has done a study together with the Center for International Environmental Law on climate change and human rights, which is in our shared document room, where we have asked a lot of national human rights institutions to share their experiences with the impact of climate change, but also what they do. And you find there examples from more than 10, 12 national human rights institutions. So that's also further reading available in our SharePoint view. We have now, under the first point, invited the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Environment, David Boyd, to give us a contribution, but he will also address not only lead question 1, but he has also a more broad, holistic view what we should do as national human rights institution, but it's a very interesting contribution. So maybe we can play the video he has sent to us, David Boyd.
Hello from Canada. I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and I'm delighted to be joining the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions for this important webinar on human rights and climate change. This is a critical topic, and I'm just going to quickly address 3 issues. First, it is vital that we incorporate human rights into national climate commitments. And this is a golden opportunity right now because all of the parties to the Paris Agreement, which is virtually every country in the world, is required to file an updated nationally determined contribution pursuant to the Paris Agreement. So now is the time for NHRIs to be assisting and advocating for governments to include human rights in their nationally determined contributions. And we've already seen some good practices in this regard, such as from the Marshall Islands. Human rights should also be incorporated into climate legislation at the national level and into climate action plans. And Uruguay is a world leader in the way that they integrated they brought together the Ministry of Environment and the government department responsible for human rights to come up with a climate plan that integrated human rights into the climate plan. So that's an example of a good practice. Second is climate litigation. There have been more than 50 lawsuits around the world now that are based on allegations that human rights are being violated by governments' failure to take adequate climate actions, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. The 2 leading cases to this point are the decision of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in the Urgenda case and the decision of the Supreme Court of Colombia in the Future Generations case. Both cases which found human rights had been violated by governments' inadequate actions and courts ordered the governments to take additional actions. There is definitely a role for NHRIs to play in climate litigation. I'm involved in a lawsuit that's recently was heard by the Supreme Court of Norway on the question of whether new licenses for offshore oil and gas exploration at this point in the climate emergency violate the constitutional right to a healthy environment in Norway. And as part of that case, the Norwegian National Human Rights Institution filed an excellent amicus curiae brief. And the third role for NHRIs relates to monitoring and reporting. And of course, it's critically important to gather information about the impacts that climate change is having at the national level, impacts which are being felt in every country in the world and which are disproportionately impacting vulnerable people, people living in poverty, people of color, people like women, persons with disabilities, children, and the elderly. And so monitoring is critical and reporting that both at a national level, and I think NHRIs also could contribute by conveying those monitoring results to international processes such as the Universal Periodic Review held by the UN Human Rights Council. So going forward, I think there's a tremendous potential for NHRIs to not only influence the course of government policy, but to play a really key role in accelerating climate action over the next decade, which we know is absolutely critical for the protection of human rights worldwide. Thank you for your attention today, and good luck with the rest of your session. It's vitally important work that you all are doing. So thank you very much for what you do on behalf of this beautiful planet and all of its people.
So we have to say thank you for David Boyd for this nice speech. And he was already indicating what are the potential roles national human rights institutions might play in influencing national policies, in doing climate litigation. And we will come back to the case from Norway, and in monitoring and reporting. And don't let us forget what Michelle Bachelet was saying also in public awareness raising and empowering and educating. So in order to bring us a bit together, we have initiated a poll, which we want to do. And we can now all make a poll. Maybe you can just stick to one of the 4 boxes, which are for you the most important, let's say, steps we could do. You can even stick to several of these let's say, different options, and you can see that the 4 things which we just have heard are all mentioned there. Shall we focus on courts and litigation strategies in our work with governments and national action plans, with communities educating and empowering, or also through monitoring and reporting? And you can stick to 1, 2, 3, or 4, which are for you the most important ones, and we will see a result very soon. and just to give us an idea and have some participation in our online meeting. Yeah. So while there is an account doing done, I think we can now continue with our lead question 2, and we will see the result of our poll in a minute. We have now the lead question 2, which would be then identifying not only the impacts, but now looking at what can national human rights institutions do in national politics on climate change, in commitments, in policies, in laws. So what approaches can we take nationally, regionally? What are promising strategies with which actors we should play, and what are potential challenges and how to deal with them at the national level? And we have invited again 4 speakers from, in a way, national human rights institutions, and then 2 guest speakers. And let's start with Judith from the National Human Rights Institution of Scotland.
Sorry. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to Ganri for the invitation to speak here. In Scotland, we have tackled this problem very much both through policy interventions to government and to encourage the government to take a rights-based approach to 2 obvious climate change pieces of policy, both carbon reductions and the reduction in emissions, and to mitigation internationally. In mitigation, we worked with the government some time ago to look at, from a concept of climate justice, which brings together those right to healthy environment and human rights impacts, to develop, and the government then decided to develop a climate justice fund, which was entirely focused on supporting processes and projects internationally to support mitigation of climate impacts, a really important part of a national strategic approach to addressing climate change. But also in Scotland, we have sought to encourage the government to take that rights-based approach to their own domestic policy making, to incorporate the right to a healthy environment into Scots law, and that work is progressing at the moment, but also to take into consideration, as we build back from the global pandemic, that human rights are core to that building back, but so also is the right to a healthy environment. And to bring these 2, sometimes seen as separate, but very much interrelated agendas into one space. And we have done that very much through the principles of human rights budgeting, and really looking at the budget and budget planning processes and income generation processes within government as a means of really investigating what are the impacts of our expenditure, and how can we do that building back better, that process of building back better, in a way which is both rights respecting and supporting our climate targets.
Thanks, Judith, for highlighting how you have tried to have a human rights-based policy approach in your own government on mitigation policies, and how to link it also to corona policies. I would now like to give the word to Lulay from the National Human Rights Institution of Samoa. Due to the large time difference, she can't speak live, so we have a video. She will talk about human rights-based relocation policies, which are a big issue in Samoa.
The people of Samoa are projected to face more extreme tropical cyclones, sea level rise, more days of extreme heat, ocean acidification, and other destructive consequences of climate change. Samoans are being disproportionately affected given their contribution to greenhouse gases of only 0.0006%. Coastal communities will be particularly impacted. 70% of the population live within 1 kilometer of the sea. Vulnerable groups and women will be at enhanced risk. In the 2009 tsunami, for instance, 70% of adults who died were females. Empirical studies show that after a natural disaster, domestic violence temporarily spikes, further impacting women. A key role for NHRIs is to prepare regular status reports from analysis, research, and observation of climate change impact on the enjoyment of human rights. They should be involved also in translating and tailoring globally agreed climate change commitments into national indicators and benchmarks that take account of local human rights realities. NHRIs must review national policies and programs to ensure activities in general and the use of climate change financial assistance in particular do not give rise to human rights concerns. Working closely with government agencies dealing with climate change is important. 1, to ensure information for reporting is meaningful and up to date, and 2, to follow up on NHRI recommendations. Poor infrastructure, legislative and otherwise, for monitoring and evaluation challenge small states, but NHRIs through annual State of Human Rights reports to Parliament can continually focus attention on unaddressed shortcomings.
So thank you for this really good impression what we can do in different levels of national policy in our annual reporting to address how better human rights can be realized when following up climate change policies. I would now like to give the floor back to Mireille from Madagascar. She would also address us a bit how this can be brought together. What is the policy advice from human rights which has to go to climate change? Mireille, you have the floor again.
Merci. Madagascar dispose depuis 2010 d'une politique nationale sur le changement climatique, mais sa mise en œuvre est demeurée très discrète. Cette politique nationale est basée sur la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur le changement climatique, ainsi que le protocole de Kyoto, mais il n'y est pas fait mention des droits de l'homme. Conformément à la loi qui l'institue, la Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme peut fournir à titre consultatif à l'exécutif ou législatif, la Cour suprême et à tout autre organe compétent, soit à la demande des autorités concernées, soit en usant de sa faculté d'autosaisine, des avis, recommandations, propositions et rapports concernant toute question relative à la promotion et la protection des droits de l'homme. Excusez-moi. Ainsi, la Commission peut proposer au ministère de l'Environnement l'introduction des droits humains comme composante au cœur de la politique nationale sur le changement climatique. D'autre part, la loi prévoit également que la CNIDH soit associée à l'élaboration des programmes concernant l'enseignement et la recherche sur les droits de l'homme et participe à leur mise en œuvre dans les milieux scolaires, universitaires, sociaux et professionnels. Elle pourrait ainsi approfondir sa collaboration avec la faculté de droit et de sciences politiques de l'Université d'Antananarivo pour la sensibilisation des jeunes aux interconnexions entre changement climatique et droits humains. L'échange d'expériences avec les autres pays notoirement confrontés au changement climatique, notamment du continent africain, à travers le réseau des institutions nationales de droits de l'homme, le RINAD, contribuerait à une meilleure efficacité des actions entreprises. Voilà, excusez-moi, j'espère que je n'ai pas dépassé les 2 minutes. Merci.
Thank you, Mireille, for this intervention. And it's good to see that in all our online work, we all have, let's say, other persons to see. That's nice to see. We all work from home, or many of us. Yeah. So here we can see the results from our poll, and you can see that Yeah, we have at least the helping the governments in responding is 70%, communicating, educating and empowering is 62%, monitoring, reporting is at least 60%, and litigation is at least for 1/3 of us, an extremely important component. It shows we need the different elements, which has been raised also by Michelle Bachelet, by David Boyd, and also our colleagues from UNDP and UNEP. And this is a good start. We would like to continue now with giving the floor to Juan José Berkel from the National Human Rights Institution in Argentina, and he's thinking a bit together the policy advice on human rights and climate change with their work on implementing the SDG commitments. Juan José, you have the word.
Bueno, primero parto de la base que nosotros por nuestro derecho interno tenemos, la Constitución Nacional nos marca que el cambio climático en realidad es una afectación del medio ambiente, y el medio ambiente es en realidad un derecho y un derecho humano porque coincide con la conceptualización de la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos. O sea, porque establece la Constitución Nacional que todos los habitantes tienen derecho a un ambiente sano, equilibrado, apto para el desarrollo integral de las personas, y también para satisfacer las necesidades de las generaciones presentes sin comprometer las necesidades de las generaciones futuras. El concepto de dignidad de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos va complementado con el artículo 25, derecho a la salud, derecho al bienestar, artículo 29, derecho al desarrollo integral. O sea, el medio ambiente es un interés jurídicamente tutelado, que es lo que da el concepto de derecho, y por lo tanto es un derecho humano. Así que nosotros hemos trabajado mucho en el desarrollo de los ODS, sobre todo partiendo de la base que el objetivo 13 lo puntualiza expresamente al cambio climático como afectación del medio ambiente, y el punto 2 exige, mejor dicho, la meta 13.2 exige tener presente lo relativo al cambio climático en todas las políticas, estrategias y planes nacionales. Además, hay que tener en cuenta que a partir del Acuerdo de París, Argentina conformó el Gabinete Nacional de Cambio Climático con miembros de todos los ministerios y secretarías de Estado, y se comprometió a la próxima COP a revisar la reducción de los gases de efecto invernadero. Así que eso es lo que estamos monitoreando.
Thanks a lot, Juan José Berkel, for these insights, how you link the work on human rights and climate change together with the SDG monitoring in your own country. We have two more interventions focusing on the national level. The next one is a guest, and we are glad that the Special Rapporteur on Internally Displaced Persons, the new one, Cecilia Jimenez, is with us, and she has also 2 minutes. Cecilia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for this opportunity. And I really appreciate being here. One of the major impacts of climate change is internal displacement. There is an estimated at least 150 million people in the world who will be displaced within their own countries by 2050, owing to slow onset impacts of climate change. We all know climate change mostly as sudden effects, but we should also look at slow onset events, which are defined as events that evolve gradually from incremental changes occurring over many years or from an increased frequency or intensity of recurring events. And Samoa is, the example of Samoa is one of them, rising sea levels. There's also ocean acidification, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, etc., etc. So human rights of IDPs is a particular focus of many national human rights institutions all over the world. And the report that I issued to the General Assembly was precisely on the impact of the adverse effects of slow onset climate change. And it's part of your documents, and I would like to encourage you to make that as one of your reference tools. So I would like to conclude my this intervention with my main recommendation to NHRIs. Obviously, I made lots of other recommendations to states, international community, etc. But I have one specifically to NHRIs, and this is it. In relation to climate change and specifically the adverse effects of slow onset climate change and particularly internal displacement, I would like to encourage you to incorporate climate change related internal displacement, slow onset, particularly in human rights monitoring, including data collection and early warning systems, complaint handling, and support states in the implementation of their human rights obligations, and particularly with the genuine participation of internally displaced persons in all decisions affecting them in protection, prevention, and their durable solutions. After all, it is their human rights. Lastly, I take the opportunity to thank OHCHR Bangkok and the Asia Pacific NHRIs who participated in an event on this report and just 2 weeks ago. And I would like to encourage other NHRIs from other parts of the world to be able to engage with me on this particular topic. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Cecilia, for this. And before giving the floor to our Russian colleague from the Russian National Human Rights Institution, I just want to flag that if you start, or if you would not be moderator, you could read more in the chat. We have extremely interesting examples from India, from Malaysia, and also from the National Human Rights Institution of Ecuador, talking about the constitution of Ecuador. I can't read them out all because that would consume too much time, but please take the opportunity to read this. So now we have an intervention from the floor, in a way, the National Human Rights Institution from Russia, Oksana Malachiskaya, the head of Economic and Political Rights Protection Department, will address us. I think we have a translation into English, and you can read this. Yeah, so Oksana, you have the word. Thanks for being with us.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые коллеги. От лица уполномоченного по правам человека в Российской Федерации хотелось бы рассказать об интеграции прав человека в экологическую политику России. Позицию о необходимости принятия важнейшего решения в вопросе защиты окружающей среды уполномоченный выразил в тематическом докладе на тему права на благоприятную окружающую среду в Российской Федерации. Правительство поддержало его, и осенью 2019 года Российская Федерация приняла Парижское соглашение, международный договор, подписанный Россией еще в 2016 году. Для периода 2025 года государством запланированы такие меры, как формирование системы учета выбросов парниковых газов на уровне хозяйствующих субъектов, создание условий для стимулирования проектов по сокращению выбросов парниковых газов. Также в 2020 году принята поправка Конституции Российской Федерации, направленная на создание благоприятных условий жизнедеятельности населения, снижение негативного воздействия хозяйственной и иной деятельности на окружающую среду, сохранение уникального природного и биологического многообразия страны. Одним из государственных приоритетов стало развитие системы экологического образования граждан и воспитание экологической культуры. Это, по мнению уполномоченного, в перспективе окажет значительное влияние на предотвращение глобального изменения климата. Благодарю за внимание.
Thanks a lot. Spasiba. And it's good to see how much national human rights institutions can do in so different countries, from Argentina to Russia, from Samoa to Scotland. I think that is what is the enriching experience working together with a global alliance of national human rights institutions. Let's move to our third lead question. How can we support climate litigation? And we have 4 short inputs on this, and they are all 4 extremely interesting. How can national human rights institutions support climate litigation? Let's start with maybe the most intensively done case by national human rights institutions I've ever seen in this context is that from the National Human Rights Institutions of the Philippines. Let's go back to Roberto Cadiz.
Thank you very much, Michael. Am I all right? Can you hear me? Do I need to click this? All right. So NHRIs complement courts. There are many levers available to NHRIs that are not available to courts. Therefore, NHRIs may conduct their inquiries in a more expansive, more deep manner than would otherwise be available to courts. And their findings can serve as a precedent to courts when they consider climate-related litigation or cases brought before them. An example is that an NHRI may do in our experience is elaboration on the responsibilities of businesses in the context of climate change, an exposition on the UN guiding principles and on business and human rights. Normally, this would not be available to courts because these are issues that are global in nature, and usually cases that are brought before courts would concern 2 parties, one party suing another. So our basic findings are businesses should mind the impact of their activities on human rights. In particular, well, all businesses, but in particular the carbon majors should do due diligence, and part of this is the conduct of human rights impact assessments, environment and climate change impact assessment. These assessments should be inclusive. Their operations must be transparent, not only in terms of financial disclosures, but also in terms of their carbon footprint. There are many, many more responsibilities, of course, but we have no time to discuss them now. Also we said that the challenge to businesses is to help transition the global economy from fossil fuel to clean energy, and all efforts to obstruct this process of transition, to obfuscate climate science is immoral and may also be illegal. We have found grounds for finding carbon majors legally liable, but this will have to be proven before domestic courts under their respective municipal laws. I mentioned earlier obstruction, obfuscation, violations of fiduciary duty towards their shareholders, fraud against investors, tort law, non-compliance with regulatory measures, such as with reportorial requirements. And there were also some findings regarding criminal responsibility, as was done in the Kiobel case, which was, of course, which unfortunately was dismissed by the American Supreme Court, but the grounds therein we definitely find are productive of a finding of criminal liability. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberto. And I can only recommend reading more about the carbon major case of the National Human Rights Institution of the Philippines on their own website, but also maybe in our SharePoint, our booklet, which I have mentioned at the beginning. Let's briefly go back to Dennis in the Netherlands, where in December last year, there was a major decision challenging the government of Netherlands' inactivity or not supportant activity on climate change. Dennis.
Thank you, Michael. I think there's an incredibly important role for HRIs to play in the context of litigation, especially with regards to holding governments to account for their insufficient measures to reduce their emissions, their grossly insufficient measures. And it can be in a direct way, which was already mentioned by David Boyd as an amicus, but also in an indirect way. If you look at the the judgment of the Dutch Supreme Court, but also other courts, for the interpretation of the human rights and fundamental rights that they are looking at in the context of their litigation. They are looking at a lot of international bodies. They are looking at findings from UN treaty bodies and special procedures on what other institutions globally are finding with regards to the impact of climate change on human rights, but also with regards to what precisely the obligations under these human rights obligations are, more precisely whether human rights are really a basis for the obligation to reduce emissions. So just for instance, how this can be influenced is, for instance, by providing parallel reports to UN treaty bodies on both the impacts on human rights, but also on the policies of a state with regards to its emission reductions. But NRIs can also conduct their own inquiries, which in itself can provide a basis for future litigation, be it in the country itself or in other countries. And particularly on the sufficiency of countries' mitigation efforts to reduce their emissions, NRIs can conduct inquiries on what the exact policies of a country are. Look at where the money is being spent. Is the money being spent on fossil fuel infrastructure or on the technologies that we need to get to zero emission? Does the country really have a credible path towards zero emission? And the NHRI doesn't need to know this itself. They can just ask the question, which is already hugely valuable and will put scrutiny on the state. They can also investigate whether the efforts of the governments really reflect the highest level of ambition as is laid down in the Paris Agreement. And not just by asking governments, but also asking other experts that do have this expertise.
Thanks, Dennis, for highlighting what can be put to scrutiny in courts and how important it can be. Now let's have a look at the situation in Kenya. Anne Okutoi from the National Human Rights Institution of Kenya, they had made a case on forest conservation and on climate mitigation measures and the rights of indigenous people. Anna, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Michael. Allow me to start the conversation by just stating the Kenyan context with regards to forest resources as being really an immense importance due to their contribution to economic development, issues around rural livelihoods, and for the environment and ecosystem that they provide. So basically, if you look at the context of forests in Kenya, is that they help support the operations of most of the key economic sectors, including agriculture, horticulture, tourism, wildlife, and energy. Hence, you'll find in our highest law, that is the Constitution, that the right to a clean, safe, and healthy and sustainable environment is really key to fulfillment of other rights. So again, just on the Kenyan context with regards to forests and why the conversation is key, is that if you look at the statistics, is that Kenya loses around 12,000 hectares of forest each year through deforestation. So about 12% of the land area, which was originally covered by forests, has been reduced. So the government actually has signed up obligations to raise this forest cover to 10%. And as a result has embarked on various interventions, which unfortunately have had a brunt on human rights issues, especially those of indigenous communities and forest dwellers. One of the things that the Commission has over the years done is monitor and document the worrying trend of human rights violations amidst the forest conservation efforts by the government. And this is in particular with reference to various indigenous communities that inhabit in the forest. And these violations have ranged from, forceful and very violent evictions, killings, sexual violence, destruction of property, mostly attributed to the forest rangers. And these cases have been litigated all the way to the African Commission on Human Rights and also the African Court that has given rulings on this. So the Commission has been working keenly in supporting the implementation of the court decision through community sensitization, a dialogue with government, and giving its advisory on what needs to be done. allow me to just mention one of the key things that the Commission, through its mediation and dialogue with government, is that it has entered into a partnership with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. This is the key ministry in charge of forest conservation, to come up with a training curriculum and a manual to mainstream human rights-based approaches in forest conservation, but with a keen focus on the protection and management, with a deliberate emphasis on protection of women, youth, indigenous communities, minority and marginalized communities. And as a result, we've been able to really secure dialogue between the government and community members in an attempt to secure the right of conservation, but at the same time, secure the rights of vulnerable people, specifically the indigenous communities that dwell in this forest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna, for this very excellent example where you, in one policy area, can even have a lot of impact on particularly vulnerable groups. Thanks very much for this. Before going now to the National Human Rights Institutions from Norway, whose amicus curiae was already highlighted by David Boyd, the special rapporteur, just to let you know, if you read the chat box, you find examples from Slovenia, Malaysia, Ecuador, Morocco. Please continue to have a look there, one eye there, 2 ears for listening to us. And now we listen to Jenny Sandvik from the Norwegian National Human Rights Institutions and their amicus curiae brief in that case, which David was already mentioning. Jenny, you have the floor.
Thank you, and hi everyone, and thank you for very interesting interventions. My name is Jenny Sandvik. I work at the Norwegian National Human Rights Institution. And we've been asked to provide a short intervention from the floor about our amicus brief in the Supreme Court case mentioned by the Special Rapporteur. So the issue in the case was the legality of licenses to search for oil and gas in the Arctic. And our amicus is available to you on the SharePoint. The purpose of our amicus brief was to clarify the human rights obligations of the Norwegian Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights, the rights to life and the rights to private life and home. And we argued along 3 lines. First, the state has a positive and negative human rights obligation to, under these provisions, to protect its citizens against the dangers of climate change and must do what is necessary and sufficient to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Taking into account the precautionary principle and the risk for tipping points. 2, the state is obliged under the Norwegian Constitution and its provision on a right to a healthy environment to safeguard the rights of future generations to a safe climate. And 3, Norway, as a major exporter of fossil fuels, has to take into account the emissions from combustion of exported oil and gas emissions from Norway when assessing the legality under human rights law with respect to climate impacts of licenses to search for new oil and gas. The case has not been decided yet, but our work on this field does not stop here. This is supposed to be our main priority going forward. And we have published an extensive report on climate change and human rights, which we will shortly launch in English. And I do think personally that national human rights institutions have an important role to play in advancing human rights obligations to limit global warming, particularly as climate change affects the very youngest and most vulnerable amongst us. And we believe that NHRIs are crucial to make their voices and interests heard. And we are also very much interested in collaborating with other institutions on this topic. So please get in touch if you would like to discuss this further. I thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I encourage you reading these 83 pages of this amicus curiae, but it's really worthwhile reading how the argumentation has been done. It's very nice. So I think we got some smell how it looks when national human rights institutions go into casework, complaints and litigation. Now we will go to our last round, which is what can we do concerning monitoring and reporting. And maybe let me start by saying I'm a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we have, as a treaty body, started now to systematically ask states always when they come to review to our committee to report both on the impact of mitigation. So we had asked Norway already on, let's say, these oil exports. We had asked Australia on a new coal mine and others. So mitigation is always a question we ask. And we also ask on adaptation. What do you do concerning, let's say, making sure that the people have enough food, that the health issues are addressed properly in agriculture, in infrastructure, and so forth. So we get more and more reports from let's say also states, but it's also a good opportunity from national human rights institutions to present their information to treaty bodies. It's not only us, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, you can do it also for the Child Rights Committee, the CEDAW and others. So please use it. I think that is a big opportunity. There's also the opportunity to report on SDGs. We will hear back from Juan in a minute. Yeah, there is this voluntary review going on what's in New York, on the SDG implementation, or you have now reporting more and more in the climate system. We have on national determined contribution and monitoring. In 2023, there will be a global stock take to take place on implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we have other opportunities in the climate change system to report also there. These are all opportunities which we can have nationally, also to influence the national debates with our monitoring results, the international and national things, and bring this together. The reports we consider at international levels, we can also use at national levels. I think that is what is really the frame for monitoring, where national human rights institutions are extremely needed to prove what is the concrete impact on specific people, particularly vulnerable people of climate change, that it's not an abstract saying, oh, there is impact, but to make it more specific and to identify what states can do. This is just to say this as a committee member, how important is the contribution of national human rights institutions in this. I also want to recall that also that NGOs have started to give us inputs, like the Center for International Environmental Law, which consistently brings us also information on the issue to all committee sessions. There's also a role for NGOs, but particularly there is a role for national human rights institutions. So let's listen in the few remaining minutes to some examples, and I might go back now first to Juan Jose from Argentina, who will give us some ideas how they use the SDG monitoring for this. Juan, you have the floor again.
Hola.
Hola.
¿Escuchan? Bien. Bueno, acá aparece. Bueno, nosotros comenzamos con vinculando los ODS con las recomendaciones del examen periódico universal. Entonces aprovechamos las investigaciones que en un principio fueron 49 de la Agenda 2030 y la trasladamos a cada una de las recomendaciones del examen periódico universal para después poder contestar con un alto grado de certeza. También la utilizamos para las contestaciones o para los informes a los distintos relatores que nos visitan. Pero ahora estamos yendo más allá con el asunto de las alianzas. Y entonces nos ubicamos en el proyecto CERALC. Y gracias a ese proyecto CERALC convocamos, la Defensoría convocó a un acuerdo o a un plan sectorial para la industria minera que respete los principios rectores, que los principios rectores son proteger por parte de las autoridades, respetar por parte de las empresas y los individuos que hagan actividades extractivas y remediar para el caso que haya alguna violación a algún derecho humano. Entonces, eso para nosotros es muy importante porque abarca no solamente los derechos taxativamente enumerados en nuestras constituciones, pero sobre todo en la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos, sino también el medio ambiente. Así que estamos con las provincias mineras para tratar de lograr que ese plan sectorial vaya en el plan, le dé contenido al plan estratégico nacional. Y contamos, ya hicimos varias reuniones con la ayuda de Unión Europea, la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, OIT y me queda, y la OCDE. Entonces incorporamos principios rectores, convenios 179, declaración tripartita y guías de debida diligencia.
Muchas gracias. Thanks a lot, Juan, for this example. I just want to flag that we are a bit delayed. We had some nice statements from Lulay from Samoa and from our colleagues from Colombia. Both videos has been sent to us. We don't show them now, but you can find them in the SharePoint. Please go there. They report what they do on monitoring. Samoa has done a good analysis of the human rights impact of climate change within the country. And also Colombia has done a good documentary on indigenous people's rights and environmental human rights defenders. So these are good examples. Follow them later on our SharePoint. I now give the floor back to Anne from Kenya. Yeah, she has also a 2 minutes intervention.
Thank you, Michael. Very quickly, in terms of our interventions on monitoring and reporting on human rights and climate issues, just to mention that over the years, we've continuously utilized our A status at the GANRI and the affiliate status at the African Commission to continuously advance for the rights, in terms of indigenous communities' rights, but also areas around forest conservation and climate change through alternative reports to the various human rights mechanisms and also the various interactions with the various special procedures. So nationally, our commission is strategically placed in important committees and working groups that are charged with state reporting, including the National Committee on International and Regional Human Rights Obligations, and also the Technical Working Committee on the SDGs Voluntary National Reporting. So through memberships in these platforms, the Commission continuously infuses a human rights-based approach in how the state undertakes its reporting, and especially we encourage the government to have disaggregated data that elevates the issues of vulnerable groups in this important topic. Lastly, is that just to give examples, is that we've worked with the government in developing its reports, specifically under Goal 13 in Kenya's voluntary national reporting, and also under the ICCPR with a focus once again on the rights of indigenous persons as we advance forest conservations, among other climate change issues. Lastly, under the UPR mechanism, we have continuously mobilized civil society organizations to escalate their issues. And also the KNCHR, the Commission, continues monitoring government's obligations in order to advance the rights of these groups. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. I just want to flag that we might continue 5 minutes longer. We got an okay from the interpreters that they might continue with us. That's very helpful. I don't want to extend it to a large degree, but maybe 5 minutes are needed. We have a short last intervention by Judith from the Scottish National Human Rights Institutions. In between, I want to highlight that we have another interesting discussion in the chat from examples Bolivia, Morocco, Jordan. So please take note of this. And also we have been referred to our SharePoint where most of the information are there. Also our booklet of examples from National Human Rights Institutions. But now I give the floor to Judith from Scotland.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just want to highlight two things that are happening in Scotland. One I alluded to earlier, which is the establishment of a national task force to strengthen human rights laws in Scotland. And that task force is looking at the full incorporation, to the degree that the Scottish Government and Parliament can do, of economic, social, cultural rights, to incorporate the right to a healthy environment, and also looking to see whether or not the incorporation of other group-based rights, the CEDAW, CERD, and the CRPD can be encompassed in a single piece of legislation. Now, the key reporting and monitoring obligations in relation to that legislation sit with the government, and the intention is that as we make progress in terms of developing that legislation and working in partnership with government, with civil society, with the legal profession, the whole range of actors and stakeholders, local government across Scotland, that process really looks to build an integrated means of building access to justice, routes to access to justice, routes to remedy, which really cut across both all the rights, in fact, that we're seeking to incorporate. I think that building solid and accountable monitoring mechanisms into that monitoring and reporting mechanisms on the part of government is an important role for the NHRI. So our understanding of the importance of monitoring and accountability in these systems is a crucial contributor. The other key piece of work I want to highlight is the work we've been doing on human rights-based budgeting. I mentioned it earlier, but where it becomes specific in this context relates back to Dennis's comment earlier. Our role has been to both, in the first to scrutinise the budget, very much with the mind of see how possible is it to do that from a human rights perspective, and that in and of itself has proved incredibly challenging. We've learned a huge number of lessons to see how transparent the budget is, how participatory the development of the budget is. I'm talking here about the Scottish Government's budget, its expenditure budget, and also its resource raising budget. And so we've really built a body of work, I would say, which you can access on our website massively, a toolkit, and have moved into that sphere of building capacity amongst civil society organisations so that they too can be better equipped to interrogate the budget allocation and to see, well, how is the government fulfilling its policy obligations in this context around climate change and climate justice. Does the budget stack up? Does it look like that's really happening when you actually look at how money is being spent? It's a really important part of a monitoring process. And so we are undertaking that work in a general context across a range of rights, and we'll look over the next years to focus that on different aspects, including those in relation to climate change. I also want to finally highlight that COP26 is happening in Scotland next year, next November, as having obviously been delayed as a result of COVID. It's still going ahead, and the Scottish Human Rights Commission is playing a role in terms of both doing that capacity building, facilitating NHRIs to participate on the side of that event, but also will be developing over this coming year our own asks of government and contribution to that COP agenda. So look forward to participating and sharing with other NHRIs around the world for their impacts and influences. We have a lot to learn, both in Scotland and elsewhere on other people's expertise. Thank you so much for enabling us to contribute today.
Thanks, Judith. Well, now we are done with our panels, and I think we got a good insight of the, let's say, colors of national human rights institutions and the different types of works we are doing. Now we want to come to the closure, which would be an adoption of a statement. And I just want to recall that we had prepared a 5-6 page long statement for the March meeting, which we wanted to discuss at our annual conference in March. In person, this wasn't now possible, but we had prepared it with a small climate change caucus working group, which we had among national human rights institutions. We have now condensed the paper together with the Secretariat and also our UN partners to a 2.5 page statement, and we put it on the website on Wednesday. We gave you the opportunity to comment on this, but we haven't received any negative inputs yet. So it's the way we have develop this. And we would like to encourage us all maybe to endorse that statement, because it would be an expression of our own together common commitment in becoming active. It would give us a mandate if we start talking in the area of climate change negotiations with this statement at the back. That would be really helpful. It's not a binding commitment to each of us. It's a, let's say, an endorsement of let's work more together. And the statement, which has starts with some principal argumentations, some principal problems, mentioned the impact of climate change on human rights. It talks then about the national commitments we would like to do as national human rights institutions in promotion, monitoring, complaints, litigation. It talks about international commitments which we have as a bridge builder, working together, doing the monitoring at international levels. It talks particularly about monitoring and reporting, the opportunities which we have nationally, but also internationally. And he talks about cooperation among us as national human rights institutions, but also with our UN partners. And we have co-organized the event with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNDP, and UN Environmental Program. But we had also 2 special rapporteurs already helping us or being with us. So it shows that there are more opportunities for collaboration. So now I would give, in a way, the poll to us for making a judgment or endorsement of our statement. And I think the Secretariat will open it up for the adoption of the statement. So you can say yes, no, and you can abstain. And then we have an idea if this statement is supported. You find the whole statement on our SharePoint. It was sent around. So please give us your vote on this. And then we will see the result. And while this is collected, maybe I start already with some closing words. I will get, I think, an indication from the Secretariat when the poll is ready. I just want to say that we have also some contributions on the chat from Sarah Rattray from UNDP. We had Alan Vronsky, who was reporting from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We had also a short note from CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. I think there are a lot of actors working with us. And I want to say one of the ideas after the adoption of the statement is that we extend our small climate caucus group, which we had yet in Ganri, to be broader. Yeah, we would like to invite you all to give us an incidence if you would join this climate exchange working group, in a way, our climate caucus, because this would allow us on all these 4 elements of where we could intervene to exchange and build up maybe a form of knowledge sharing, yeah, and develop common strategies. So that would be very helpful if we could do this, and you are all encouraged to do so. We also want to say that for the COP26 Judith was talking about, we were already planning this year to have there a seminar of interested national human rights institutions, maybe to come together to discuss our common strategy on monitoring, reporting, how we can act as national human rights institutions in the framework of the climate negotiations, because this is an own international environment. It's not only the human rights environment which we have to address, we have to learn, and we want to come together and discuss how we can see this. We will also have 1 or 2 panels together organized with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and national human rights and some NGOs. So we will be active at this COP26. And we have already started to discuss with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and with UNEP and UNDP if we should not have a seminar either in May or June. We would invite you to develop a better methodology for our own monitoring work at the international level. So this is what we are going to plan. We don't know if we can have the seminar, probably not in person, because it is too early before we get certain management better with COVID, but we will have at least an electronic opportunity of 1 or 2 days to develop this monitoring methodology. So these are already specific activities we would like to follow up. Yeah. So now we will send the results of our voting. Katharina, we see that we have a 96% support of that and 1 abstention. Thank you very much for this. It's a very clear mandate. We wanted to have an endorsement of our statement. Thank you really for this. Now I would like to say we have to work as national human rights institutions at all 4 levels. I think that's what we have learned. Yeah, we can influence national climate policies by integrating human rights into the understanding and discussions at the national level in the formulation of national determined contributions. We learned how we can be important in education, awareness raising, information to maybe those really affected by climate change, how to make their cases known, that they know it's also human rights violations which they are confronted with, and discussing with them together how one can maybe act in favor of them and make sure that adaptation policies at the national level are negatively impacting particularly these vulnerable groups. We have talked thirdly about this monitoring and reporting. How important is it to follow up nationally? We heard from national budgets up to forest policies in a way, yeah? What we can all monitor. We can compare this with the SDG commitments, as Juan was saying. So all these levels are there where we can really, in a way, play our role, yeah, in promotion and protection of human rights by doing a good monitoring and reporting role. And if we are clever enough and develop this common methodology, as I said, we can also bring these then to national reporting frames in treaty bodies, in the UPR, in the SDG context, but also in the climate change context to the global stocktake. I think that is the opportunities which we have. And fourth, and not lastly, we have the opportunity for litigation. We have some very encouraging experiences from the Philippines to Norway, from Kenya to the Netherlands, how this can work, why it is so influential, and that these court cases can also help challenging maybe governments' active or inactive roles, or maybe going into the wrong policy direction. So it's really an opportunity which we have in moving the climate agenda to become human rights sensitive. So with that, my role is ending as a moderator. I would like to hand over the floor back to our chair, Freddy Carrion Intriago, to close formally the meeting. Let me say, I would like to thank as a chair, particularly you all being so long with us, but also the Secretariat for this very good functioning system of a meeting which we have. And thanks for all your rich contributions as a moderator. But now, Freddy, you have the floor as our chair to close the meeting. Con mucho, I give you the floor.
Muchas gracias, Michael. Y bueno, primero agradecer a cada uno de ustedes, a los participantes, a los panelistas, por estas importantes, decididas participaciones y aportes desde el punto de vista de la experiencia que genera nuestra participación como instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos dentro de este tema tan fundamental para la humanidad. El cambio climático, y cómo eso impacta en el desarrollo de nuestros pueblos y cuál va a ser nuestro rol como instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos. Como ustedes conocen y ha sido parte de este panel, el cambio climático y sus impactos es uno de los mayores desafíos actuales y que va a repercute directa e indirectamente en el pleno disfruto de los derechos humanos, los derechos económicos, sociales, culturales, ambientales y, por supuesto, los derechos civiles y políticos. Nos preocupa que el cambio climático afecte de manera desproporcionada a las personas más vulnerables, además de reforzar y de profundizar las desigualdades económicas, sociales, culturales que existen en nuestros países. Las medidas de políticas tomadas por los estados, por los gobiernos para combatir, mitigar y reducir los impactos podrían no ser lo suficientemente incidentes, lo suficientemente importantes como para detener estos impactos negativos que está sucediendo a nivel del mundo entero. Por ello es fundamental que dentro de este cambio perdón, no sé si me estaban escuchando. Mencionaba de que uno de los temas fundamentales dentro de esta experiencia que hemos tenido como instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos es justamente generar las políticas necesarias para que nuestros estados, incidir para que nuestros estados y nuestros países tomen las medidas necesarias a efectos de reducir y mitigar los impactos negativos que tiene el cambio climático en nuestros países, en el mundo entero. Sobre la base de eso hacemos un llamado a nuestros países, a nuestros estados, a los representantes de cada uno de los gobiernos para que ratifiquen e implementen los tratados internacionales y regionales de derechos humanos, teniendo en cuenta las recomendaciones y orientación del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de la ONU, los procedimientos especiales de la ONU y los tratados de la ONU. Celebramos que hasta la fecha 195 estados hayan firmado y 189 hayan ratificado el Acuerdo de París, y hacemos un llamado para que todos los estados que aún no han ratificado los implementen estas disposiciones del Acuerdo de París, que es un paso importante, fundamental para la promoción de posiciones climáticas centradas en las personas y basadas en los derechos humanos, ya que se refiere explícitamente a la obligación que tienen los estados de respetar, promover y considerar la protección de los derechos humanos al tomar medidas para abordar el cambio climático. La Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible está dirigida a todos los países y puede ayudar a fomentar e implementar significativamente el Acuerdo de París. Esa debe ser nuestro norte, ese debe ser nuestro objetivo final frente a la política de cada uno de los estados de incidir y de exigir que de parte de nuestros gobiernos se respete, se garanticen a través del cumplimiento de las disposiciones de los tratados y acuerdos internacionales esta necesidad fundamental: detener y mitigar los efectos negativos del cambio climático. Nuevamente quiero agradecer a cada uno de ustedes, colegas de las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, a nuestra oficina central del GANRE, así como también a quienes han intervenido, a las autoridades del Sistema de Naciones Unidas, quienes nos han entregado sus palabras, de aliento, de fortaleza, para continuar con esta decidida lucha que como instituciones nacionales tenemos en el país y en el mundo entero. De parte de GANRI, mis felicitaciones, mi agradecimiento a cada uno de ustedes, y para finalizar con este cierre de la conferencia anual de GANRI, hacer votos para que continuemos con este trabajo completamente decidido, necesario en nuestros gobiernos, en nuestros estados, para poner a los derechos humanos como meta fundamental y sobre todo como una política de Estado. A todos y a todas, muchas gracias.